Dear Anne-Claire, ladies and gentlemen, let's start into this new session. I welcome you to the second lecture within our lecture series on philanthropy, giving and collecting, trying to find an answer on the question of, is it a timeless cultural and social practice? Today, Ms. Pache from ESSEC Business School will introduce us into the history and presence of philanthropy in France. But before Gudrun-Christine will introduce Ms. Pache, let me give you some further information. As you could read on our website, this event will be recorded. It will be made available online later. So with regard to data protection, we conclude that if you participate in this meeting, you agree with the recording. By the way, the recording of our last session is online now, and you will find the link on our website. Another point, compared to our first meeting, our kickoff 2 weeks ago, we made arrangements to allow for more interaction in the discussion after the presentation. Of course, you can still write your questions into the chat, but you can also post them yourself. To do so, please write in the chat that you want to speak out. We will put you then on the list of the speakers. When we ask for your contribution, please don't forget to switch on your camera and microphone before you start speaking. And while the event today is in English, you can also ask your questions in German or write into the chat in German, and we will try to translate and interpret the question and the answer. And a last point, to avoid noise and disturbance in the background and to facilitate the broadcast, please switch your microphone and camera off when you're not speaking. So that's for the organization in the beginning. And Volker, I would pass the word to you.
Well, good afternoon to all of you, and a special welcome to you, Anne-Claire, our colleague Anne-Claire Pache, professor in social innovation at the École des Sciences Sociales et Commerciales à Paris, at the ESSEC Business School in Paris. And I particularly welcome you, Anne-Claire, as the holder of a chair in philanthropy, a chair that you have been holding for 10 years, I think it is now, since we first met for the inauguration of your chair and its work. And you will also find that Anne-Claire is perfectly prepared for discussing with us the issues of giving, philanthropy, and also to some extent collecting, because she has a management degree from in the end also a PhD from the INSEAD Business School with Felipe Santos and on social entrepreneurship. She has a management degree from ESSEC Business School, but she has also a master in urban planning and a master in public administration. So who could be better prepared to introduce us to the implications of philanthropy in French society and an abbreviated short overview of French history of philanthropy. And we'll be curious to discover similarities or differences from our comparative point of view. It is our pleasure that you have been joining us for this afternoon, and je vous souhaite la bienvenue.
Thank you so much, Volker. Dankeschön. As I was sharing with Volker, I studied German for 12 years, actually, quite a long time ago now. And at some point I was almost fluent in German, and I wish I could do today that presentation in Dutch, but in German, but I cannot anymore, which is very, very sad. And I'm not even sure that I will be able to understand your questions in writing or orally. But it's really a great pleasure, a great honor for me to participate in this seminar series. I have to say that as we launched the chair in philanthropy at ESSEC Business School. What had been developed at the University of Heidelberg and the CSI in particular was certainly an inspiration and a model. And so it's really with great pleasure that I'm now participating in this conversation in a very humble way. I want to share with you a bit of a history of philanthropy in France from the Middle Ages until today, and I'm really looking forward to discussing what may be similar and different in our history from what happened in Germany or more broadly at a European level. The chair in philanthropy that I'm chairing is a research center within the business school that is really focusing on producing research and knowledge on philanthropy. When we launched the chair in 2011, there was no academic institution that was actually looking at philanthropy as a phenomenon worth of interest. And so it's also a sign of the fact that the French philanthropy has experienced some major evolutions in the past years. So, without further ado, thank you again for having me, and let me try to tell you a bit of that history. We can start with the first slide. So, if we want to look at philanthropy in France, we need to go back to the Middle Ages, which is when we saw the emergence of foundations understood as these organizations where private assets are located that can be used to produce services to the people, let's say broadly. In the Middle Ages, most foundations, if not all, were created by the church, and they were mainly operating orphanages and hospices, places where people that were somehow excluded from a society were taken care of. In some ways, they were even, created as a way to, protect the rest of the population from either, sick people or, making sure that the kids that were without families could be, somehow protected from society. Importantly, quite quickly, these foundations actually developed somehow in contradiction with the intentions and the will of the powerfuls, there was no formal state at the time, but they were, kings and kingdoms, and the foundations that were created at the time were already, perceived by the kings as problematic in a sense that they were representing what we call la main morte, les biens de main morte, which can be translated as dead hand. I'm not sure if it really means anything, but that is basically, private money that is, located in a given estate and that can be transmitted from generation to generation while escaping inheritance taxes. So for the kings that were, viewing these estates as being really independent and from their kingdoms and that were on which they had no control, foundations were perceived already in the Middle Ages as problematic. And so in the 16 and 1700s, a few laws and decisions were made first to allow the king to have more control over these religious foundations. They were first subject to king authorizations, then they were forbidden to be created. Existing foundations were there, but no new foundations could be created. Interestingly, what we today still know as the oldest French foundation was created during that period in 1443. It was a foundation that was created to support a hospital in Beaune in the Burgundy region. And in that foundation, a couple decided to give some vineyards, very good vineyards from in the Beaune region. And until today, this foundation, cultivates and produces these vineyards that allow for the production of amazing wines that are sold every year, and the proceeds of this sale is still used until today to fund this Beaune auspices. But that's one of the very few foundations that still exist from this period. So there were a few foundations, mainly founded by the church or in relationship to the church to produce these services. We can move to the next slide. But so there was already, a lot of criticisms that were perceived not only by the, let's say, the dominant class, but also more broadly from the elite, the French elites. And here I wanted to share with you the first time that we find in archives a definition of what a foundation is, and that can be found in the great encyclopedia by Diderot, and that's a definition that is supposed to be written by Turgot, who was one of the intellectuals of the time, who writes, as you see here, a founder is a man who wants to eternalize the effect of his will. No work of men is made for immortality, since the foundations always multiplied by vanity would in the long run, absorb all the funds and all the particular properties. It is necessary that they be destroyed in the end. If all the men who have lived had a tomb, it would have been necessary in order to find land and to cultivate, to overthrow the sterile monuments and to stir up the ashes of the dead to feed the living. So, in other terms, already in the times of the Lumières, the Enlightenment in France, the elite started to question the role of these foundations as tools that were somehow escaping, the people and escaping any form of control from the leading class and from society more broadly, with this idea that the notion of immortality may not be a really fruitful overall for society. That criticism of foundations and philanthropy more specifically really blossomed at the period of the French Revolution, and we can move to the next slide, when the French Revolution was really this major upheaval in French society that not only overthrew royalty, but also put in place the fundamentals of French democracy. And at the time, the idea was really built around the notion that the state became the institution in charge of the common good and responsible for the welfare of citizens. And so both foundations as well as associations and civic organizations, which had already emerged at this period, were really conceived as somehow impediments in the relationship between the state and the people. And so during this period, the Loi Le Chapelier, so it's a law that was passed in 1791, that forbid any form of associations and any form of foundations. So at the time, all the existing foundations were either shut down or nationalized. So most of the hospitals, hospices that were then run by religious foundations were just appropriated and became, public entities. The assets that were located in these foundations were sold, and the money that was collected by the state were, used to fund the revolution. And so, at the end of the 18th century and until the end of the 19th century, France is left with, almost no foundations, with a few exceptions. The one that I mentioned, the Hospice de Beaune, managed to survive, but it's very rare. And, mainly during that period, no more associations and no more foundations existed in France. Oops. Yes, that's the next stage. Then what we see is at the end of the 19th century, a very slow rebirth of the foundation sector. The very first new foundation founded at the time was the Institut Pasteur, which speaks a lot to the situation we know today, because Pasteur was one of the inventors of vaccination, and so he felt like keeping his research activities in a university setting was maybe too limiting and too constraining for him, and so he raised funds from the greater public and created what he called a foundation. There was no legal, formal and official legal status for such an entity, but it was called and conceived in action as a foundation. And so it was founded in 1887, and it's a small sign of the rebirth of the sector. Then, as a few, families with the industrialization of France start to gain more economic prominence in France, we see the emergence of, leading families, elite families in France that start to consider that maybe they can play a role in shaping public policy and in contributing to the provision of some social activities, either for their staff members or for the greater public. So there are a few interesting foundations that were born at the time. The Rothschild Foundation, for instance, was involved in both the introduction of public housing in France in the very early 20th century. So the idea that we needed to create, large-scale, quality housing for the poor was introduced not by the state, but by this rich families. Then, leading to the development of public policy around public housing later on by the state. But so a few foundations were created either in that field or also to run hospitals. There is another 2 other hospitals were created by the Rothschild family in the form of foundations. Cognac-Jay, they were the founders of La Samaritan, which used to be a major department store in Paris, and their approach was to create schools and to create social institutions first for their own staff, the staff of their department store, but then growing more broadly to the provision of schools and private institutions for the poor. but that was still, very idiosyncratic and very emergent. In 1901, we have a major law that until today still governs the creation and the regulation of associations, so non-profit organizations that are geared towards the provision of social activities and social good. So a legal status is created in 1901 somehow, to compensate, to make up for the Loi Le Chapelier, which had destroyed all of this collective organization at the end of the 18th century then. And so in 1901 we have a legal status in France for association, this idea that citizens can get together to create activities for the common good. But at the time still the idea of creating a legal status for foundations is not there at all. And so actually the few organizations that are labeled at the time as foundations are in fact technically, legally associations. And they are again at the time very rare and very idiosyncratic, quite invisible, let's say, in the French social system. We can move to the next slide. It is only after the war the realization that the state can go as far as providing social welfare, but is not able to support all the social needs that are out there. That leads François Malraux, who was then the Minister for Culture in France, to create the Fondation de France, which really marks a new era for philanthropy and foundations in France. The Fondation de France is created by the state, technically by the government, the Minister of Culture, requiring from a few largest French banks to put money in that foundation, first really to support the funding of culture, as well as, and that was quite interesting and clever at the time, as well as to somehow house donors advice fund. I think that would be the term that would be used today. We call them Fondation Abritée in France, but it's technically Fondation de France allows private individuals to create their own small foundations that do not have an autonomous legal status, but that are somehow managed and operated within the Fondation de France. So I think it's called now Donors Advice Funds in English. And so that really was a first steps in somehow promoting this idea that private, either individuals, families, or private corporations could think about, creating or putting aside some financial resources or some specific assets that could be used to serve the common good. At the time, the Fondation de France was very, lonely in that space, but it really contributed to the emergence of the practice and providing some visibility at the national level. The dynamic around philanthropy in France actually emerged from the corporate sector. That was, in part inspired by some of the practices that had emerged in the Anglo-Saxon sector. And we see in France the creation of an organization called ADMICAL, which is the Association for the Development of Corporate Philanthropy, that was created at the end of the 70s, and that started to introduce this idea that corporations could have a role in society in contributing to the support of the arts or the support of social activities. It started again with really support for the arts as the springboard for corporate philanthropy in France. And so it's only first in 1987 and then 1990 that was written, slated in French law, the very term of foundation. 1987 it's private foundations, and in 1990 it's corporate foundations. And so it's really the first time, very recently somehow, that the French law has actually really recognized foundations as a powerful tool to contribute to the production of social value at the level of society. And so until 2003, it's mainly corporate philanthropy that and corporate foundations that take center stage in the French foundation sector. And we see a growing, with the passing of this law and a few strategic events organized by this association for the promotion of corporate philanthropy, that raises the profile of philanthropy and makes it acceptable globally, whether in the political class, in the economic elites, as well as in the greater public. But that remains, first quite small in terms of size, and relatively not visible and not very legitimate at the global societal level. Importantly, in 2003, and it's again the Minister for Culture that was somehow playing that role of changing the course of action. 2003, and we can move to the next slide, is an important date in contemporary foundation with the Loi Ayagon. Ayagon was the name of the Minister for Culture in France at the time, who realizes that public funds will never be able to satisfy all the needs that are required for the development of major public museums, for the development of cultural creations, theaters, dance shows, etc. There is a realization that private money is required to allow the state to support all this both estates and institutions that are in the French context considered as very important, public good and very important part of the French culture that the state was not able to support on its own. And so the Loi Ayagon in 2003 creates some of the most favorable conditions, I think, at the global level for the development of philanthropy in France through major tax advantages. So individuals who give, corporations who give for philanthropy can benefit from more than 60%, depending on who you are and what type of activities you give to, more than 60% of tax breaks. So this is really a way at the time for the state to create some flexibility in somehow providing citizens with the opportunity to somehow use their taxes in the way that they want by giving almost. And so this law really changes dramatically the overall context for philanthropy, changes dramatically the incentives concretely for philanthropy. Then a few years later, we see the creation in a new law of new vehicles. So we have les fonds de dotation, which would be endowment funds, and they are tools that are very easy to create. Foundations until 2007 were still quite difficult vehicles to create, requiring the authorization from the Conseil d'État and the Ministère de l'Intérieur, Ministry for Interior. And so it was still quite a heavy task to create a foundation until 2007 in France. By 2007, with the creation of the Fonds de Dotation, it becomes really easy for anyone, including with not a lot of financial means initially to put in. It becomes very easy to create these endowment funds that again create a new dynamic around foundations in France. And so philanthropy and foundations become more visible. I was meaning more accessible, more visible, and more legitimate. The creation of the philanthropy chair at ESSEC is also a sign of this growing recognition and this growing awareness also that we need to better understand what this sector is about. And so we managed to find funds, actors willing to fund such a research center at ESSEC is a sign that somehow the practice institutionalized in France and became an object that was worth academic attention, which was really not the case a few years earlier. We tried to contribute through studies. We wrote 2 books about family philanthropy and strategic philanthropy more recently, which we were told could not have been published only 10 years earlier because families would not have been ready to share their experience about their own philanthropy. And so we really see this practice as becoming much more recognized and visible at the time. And we've seen since 2003 a really dramatic growth of the sector. So it started very small, so it was not very difficult for it to grow. But I have in this next slide, some figures that show indeed, the growth of the sector. And we see, this is in French, and you see in blue, these are the number of foundations, the number of foundations per period, and it's and in blue it's the foundations, in red it's this endowment funds. And so what we see is that since the years 2000, we see a quite dramatic growth of the creation of these vehicles as a sign of the dynamism of the sector. Now there are quite interesting discussions at the French level as to what is exactly happening within these endowment funds, because there are very many of them. Some of them are actually empty. They were just created with some ideas and enthusiasm, but are actually not really having any social impact. So that's another question. But what becomes clear is that there is now a real philanthropic space and philanthropic ecosystem that exists. And we can now move to the next slide. The question now becomes, what's next for the philanthropic sector in France. I forgot to mention it, but at the same time as the fonds de dotation, these endowment funds were created in this enthusiasm about the idea that maybe foundations, were the solution to all the problems of the state, when state didn't have enough funds to fund important activities. By creating a new foundation category, maybe they were thinking they could allow for the mobilization of new funds. So there are fondation for a specific legal status for hospital foundations, for university foundations, for partnerships foundations. So there are today 7 different legal statuses, for philanthropic vehicles, which is certainly too many. It's too complex and not necessary. So that is probably not helping the visibility and the development of a coherent sector. So that's one of the current issues that the field is experiencing. We've also seen in recent years a new conversation emerge around the fiscal conditions that are currently offered for the French, philanthropic vehicles. Some, people arguing that it's actually what we call in France a niche fiscale. I'm not sure what would be the translation in English, but it would be that idea of somehow using philanthropy as a way to escape taxes, when in fact it's really the use of taxes that are somehow targeted or dedicated to public causes, but that are chosen by the philanthropist as opposed to chosen by democratically elected government. And so there are huge debates currently related to whether these favorable fiscal conditions should remain or should be changed. We've already seen that a major change in fiscal laws regarding the wealth tax that was made by President Macron when he took office, and there were specific tax exemptions for people who were for philanthropy, for people who were paying the wealth tax. And we've seen that as the wealth tax was actually partially abandoned, we've seen a major decrease in philanthropy as a consequence. So there are certainly huge worries in the philanthropic sector as to whether changes in fiscal conditions may challenge the current growth and dynamic of the sector. However, we also see growing institutionalization and a growing professionalization of the sector, with the production of research, knowledge. We contribute to this, but the Fondation de France also created this observatoire, which, for instance, produced the data that I just shared with you, and that also contributes to making it more known, transparent, visible. There are more and more organizations that somehow contribute to the sharing of best practices, the sharing of experience across philanthropic actors, that overall contributes to its institutionalization, to increasing its impact, and that will somehow strengthen it and enable its continuing growth and impact. But there are certainly still questions at the French level regarding what should be done to further strengthen that sector, while also increasing its efficiency. And so this would be, just to make it it short and to stick with the time limit that I was given, the questions that I would leave here, and I'm very much looking forward to your questions and to continue the conversation around these themes.
Well, thank you very much, Anne-Claire, for your presentation and for your journey through the history of French philanthropy. And I'm sure whoever wishes to add a question or start the conversation can have the floor now. While others are still thinking and maybe a little bit shy, let me raise a question myself that I found quite intriguing in all the history that you recollected. First of all, whenever there was a substantial change, you referred to that several times, it was culture that was stimulating, initiating the change. It was the Minister of Culture that supported and introduced new laws. It was the motivation to search for new funding streams and new private contributions to maintain the cultural heritage of France. And I do actually remember a public discussion that the minister who introduced the 2003 law, Ayagon, invited an international conference and in very carefully and elaborate words basically raised exactly this issue. We need the help of private contributions to maintain the cultural heritage of the country and to make it like a European or even an international cause. So is philanthropy disconnected, so much connected to culture and to the arts? Or is this only one view on the change, or is it also other fields where the state budgets and the state monopoly of maintaining the public good is facing limitations?
This is a great question. So certainly, it's the need to find additional resources for culture that triggered first the creation of the Fondation de France and then the Loi Ayagon, which were both in contemporary French philanthropy, were both very important steps in the growth of the sector. And it's certainly this idea of culture being considered as a public good on the one hand, so something that is, worth public attention, public policy, public investments. All major museums would be, public museums. Major theaters would be also, national or government-funded theaters. So there is on the one hand this idea that culture is a public good, and on the other one a realization that public funds are limited and that it's actually difficult to fund all the needs for culture. And so yes, then the idea was to use philanthropy to strengthen the funding for culture. But what I maybe didn't explain well enough is that whether it's the Fondation de France or whether it's the Loi Ayagon, it did certainly help to fund cultural initiatives, cultural institutions, but it certainly didn't limit itself to this specific cause. Corporate philanthropy also started with the support for culture, but also corporate philanthropy evolved over time to the support of research, and medical research in particular is a major cause that is today funded in France. Education and social services more broadly are a second very important cause that is or social issue that is currently receiving a lot of philanthropic resources. Humanitarian interventions, whether in France or internationally, are also receiving public philanthropic resources. So let's say that somehow, culture was a trigger and was a door opener for philanthropy. But philanthropy today is certainly not limited to the funding of culture. It is still certainly one of the area where philanthropic resources go, and museums like the Louvre or Musée d'Orsay do mobilize l'Opéra de Paris. They do mobilize very important philanthropic resources. I don't have the amounts on top of my mind. So they are public institutions that receive philanthropic resources in addition. So culture remains an important benefactor of philanthropic resources, and has triggered the development of private philanthropy. But today, private philanthropy in France is certainly not limited to culture, but that has probably just opened the people's minds to this idea that private money can, alongside public resources, contribute to the growth of some important public good activities. And I think there was a question by...
There was the question in the chat by Gudrun-Christine.
Yeah, I'm trying. Yes, there I am. Okay. Hello. Thank you. Thank you so much for your really interesting presentation. It is a field that I know nothing about, but I find it quite intriguing. And what I found very striking is that throughout your talk, that is from the Middle Ages to the present time, somehow foundations, or let's say institutionalized philanthropy, seems to be a defining characteristic of it, seems to be how it relates to taxes. It was always, I mean, you were relating to, the kings were actually opposed to foundations because it was a way to escape inheritance taxes, and until today, or if I understood you correctly, were also partially these foundations, private philanthropy, are seen or are let's say suspected to be a way of evading taxes. At the same time, you did talk not very much about the content of philanthropy, but I mean, right now, Volker's question, of course, touched upon that, asking about, okay, what role does culture play here? But could you can you maybe make a closer or more let's say explicit connections between taxes and what the citizen has to give to the state, and then what is done with this, and whether you see a certain development there too, a certain tendency, or Thank you.
Maybe for the context, if I may invite you, Ute, could you briefly introduce yourself so Anne-Claire knows that you are part of our project?
Oh yeah, I am part of the project, but I'm Indologist, classical Indology, so I'm dealing with India and mostly ancient India. So yeah, France is far away.
It's fascinating. So this is a great question. I would say, and maybe this is also quite specific to the French context. Although this could be debated, but certainly the evolution of philanthropy in France has been trained by the evolution of the strength and the state or the presence the state. So it's somehow when the state was rather weak, then foundations were taking more space because they were just services that needed to be provided and the state was not providing, and so religious institutions were somehow playing that role. Then with the French Revolution there is this idea that then somehow the state becomes reified, and there's this idea that it's actually the state that is in charge. And for a long time there was this idea in the French culture that as long as I pay my taxes, and so I give to the state what I owe it, then I'm done, and I don't see why I should give to philanthropy, because I'm already somehow contributed to the common good by paying my taxes. And so there is this culture quite still strong until today of the very important role of the state, and the state is really in charge of defining and providing for the common good. We call it l'intérêt général in France, the general interest, which is really something that is very prominent in all political and societal discussions. And so this is maybe one of the reasons why then the relationship to the taxes is also somehow embedded in this idea that that fiscal conditions will then somehow shape the degree to which, as a citizen, I'm willing to give to philanthropy in addition to what I already give to the state. Then, there are a lot of studies overall at a global level that discuss the impact of tax incentives on philanthropy, and it looks like although favorable tax incentives can somehow facilitate and develop philanthropic gifts, they may not be the initiators or the determinants that spurs giving. We have not seen in France any studies yet really linking tax incentives and philanthropy, but it would be very interesting to do that, to try to understand better the relationship between the two. So I'm not sure I fully answered your question, but at least that would be my initial take on this complex relationship. There's a question from Natalie, I think.
Yes, I was just wondering if Ute Hüskne was ready. Did you want to continue with the question? Okay, it was fine. So there was a question by Nathalie Rauscher in the chat, but maybe Ms. Rauscher may pose it herself, otherwise I can read it. Okay, I will read it and then she can add if she wants to. A question in comparison to the US philanthropic sector. Often it seems philanthropic activity is very much encouraged in the US to address all kinds of public needs. Do you think France is also moving in that direction, to fund more and more public needs with the help of foundations? She's also part of our network, and she's coming from American studies originally and is now starting to look into US philanthropy. That's for the background.
First, there is regulation in the fiscal regulation that defines what qualifies as philanthropic gift and what philanthropy can, what philanthropic money can be, what type of public needs can be funded by philanthropic resources. So we have like a list of activities that is actually, very, very broad. It's like from the arts, education, sports, whatever. There's a really long list of activities, but there is nevertheless a list that somehow defines what are these funds that can be allocated to philanthropy and thus benefit from this tax exemption. Compared to the US, a lot of the public services are still provided by the state. So we have, for instance, full free public education for everyone. So for instance, schools in the US, there's a lot of private schools that would be funded by philanthropic resources, or major universities, take the Harvards, and they are mainly funded by philanthropic money, when in the context of France, schools, universities, in their vast majority are state funded, and so, may not need that many private resources. Although we see now some universities creating their own foundations to raise additional funds for specific activities, but it remains quite marginal. Again, museums in the US, most museums would be not-for-profit institutions, functioning really through philanthropic resources. In the French context, the majority of the funds and the majority of the cultural institutions would be public, and the majority of their funds would be public too, although, as I just mentioned, they developed foundations also to raise additional funds. So yes, we do see certainly philanthropic resources providing for a wide range of public goods and a wide range of public needs. Certainly not in the magnitude of the philanthropic sectors. Again, hospitals, for instance, a lot of hospitals in the US would be non-profit. Most hospitals in France would be public and publicly funded. Again, they create their own small foundations, but really yes, France is moving in the direction of seeing, more and more forms of public activities or public, needs being funded by philanthropy. In very recent years, we've seen, and it has, raised issues. We've seen, local governments like cities or, collective of cities locally create their own foundation in a way that looks like, okay, it's, not only do they collect local taxes, but they, create in addition these foundations where they collect philanthropic money to fund the public activities. So there are debates as to, where is philanthropic money needed and where is it legitimate, from the state to stop funding some activities because they can be funded by philanthropy. And so, it raises question as to, what should the state provide for and what should philanthropy provide for. There are, all the associated questions as to, the undemocratic character of philanthropy being, solely decided by the person who decides to give, when a public institution has the legitimacy of proceeding through the democratic processes. And so there are debates in the French context as to what types of goods should philanthropy provide for. But I would say that overall we're still in that phase where there is excitement around the opportunities provided by the mobilization of philanthropic monies. Yet, the magnitude of these philanthropic gifts, again, if we keep the comparison to the US sector, the magnitude, is not to be compared. And so we have still, a vast majority of the resources for most public needs being provided by, either the state or through, fees and fees for service in some non-profits. So that would be my answer to Natalie's question.
Okay, thank you very much. We have another question by Felix Tresevsky.
Hello, good afternoon. Thank you very much for your lecture and the insights into the French philanthropic sector. I have a question that is kind of connected to the last parts you were talking about the kind of a critical debate around philanthropy in France. And I'd like to know a little bit more about, is that really like a major issue in public debate, in national newspapers, television, etc.? Because at least my impression in Germany, there's no big debate about philanthropy in the public discourse, and especially I would like to know a little bit more, because the moment from French philanthropy I remember mostly at the moment is like in 2019 when the church in Notre Dame was burning down, and there was a pour out of French people donating money, people from all over the world donating money, and at the same time we had kind of a critical debate around about why a society should can mobilize that kind of money in within hours, and at the same time for other issues there's a lot more difficulties in raising money. So I would be really interested to know a little bit more about that debate, and whether that's only kind of a debate in small circles, or whether that is really kind of a public thing. Thanks.
Again, really great question. Indeed, I think 16th of April 2019, and the fire at Notre Dame generated an unprecedented and that didn't reoccur since flow of philanthropic gifts in a battle that was really a battle of the major families, the Pinault, Arnaud, and Bettencourt, which are the owners of L'Oréal, Bettencourt, I'm sorry, the owners of, the heirs of L'Oréal. The Pinault is Kering, it's a luxury group, and LVMH, Arnaud is the family owning LVMH, which is these other luxury groups. And during the evening, it was really interesting for the scholars in philanthropy to see how the first family came saying, I'm gonna give 100 million, and then the next one said, I'm going to give 200 million, and then the other one had to say, wait, but I'm going to give up on my tax exemptions, and the other one said, what, but me too. It was in a night almost almost 1 billion euros were raised for the church, and so at the time they were really, discussions in French society. On the one hand, people really, praising this, huge mobilization. In addition, there were also, small givers who everyone felt connected to this, event at the French level. But there were also questions as to, what are the real motives, and why is it that they do that, and why is it that it's private monies that should pay for such a public and symbol of France and French culture and France's history. So at the time there were some debates, and it was interesting actually to see different views on philanthropy being expressed and debated in the media. It really disappeared quite quickly from the public debate. And more broadly, I would agree with you, or at least describe the state of French philanthropy. First, two ways to answer your question. First, is the philanthropic sector itself ready to be critical about its own, functioning, its own impact, its own, way of working, at the organizational level, at the sector level, in its relationship with the state and relationship with beneficiaries? Is the sector ripe for, self-criticism and progress? I would say not yet. And I think this is, one of the evidence of the fact that the sector is still at its, if not infancy, probably adolescence, certainly not a state of maturity where, foundations would be willing to say, what, I tried to work in that field, and I did this and that, and it didn't work, and I learned this and that, and I'm going to share that with others. We're not there yet. We're still at a stage where the sector is still very much in need of somehow, projecting legitimacy and in somehow, praising itself for all the good that it does, etc. And so that, I think, is a sign that the sector is not yet, fully grown up or mature. And we try with the chair in philanthropy and other actors to be in a posture that is not one of look at how the sector is great, but rather a neutral stance, able to then recognize some of the great contributions of the sector and some of the limitations of the current activities. I would say at the general public level, although, and it was interesting, we looked at the way in which in the Assemblée Nationale, in the French Parliament, when the various laws were passed, in the 80s and 90s, the first time there was a strong contradiction in particular from the Communist Party, which was saying, but this is a privatization of public good, and that should really not be funded by private interests. That criticism has really disappeared, and so in 2003 there was, overall a large consensus on the fact that it was a good thing to promote philanthropy. And at the global, societal level, first, almost all French people do give in, small amounts and to various causes, but there are a lot of people who contribute themselves to philanthropy, not by creating foundations, but by giving to Médecins Sans Frontières or to Fondation de France or to Croix-Rouge. And that also contribute to this idea that the philanthropy is one of the values that can be, it's fraternité. That it's a way to express, the fraternity dimension of the French values. So overall, I would say in society there is a broad recognition that philanthropy is important and useful. Then there is this debate, that is occurring in terms of to what extent should somehow, the state sponsor philanthropy, because by giving these tax exemptions, it's somehow, renouncing or giving up on some resources that the state should have received. And so I would say maybe these days, mainly the debate could be around this line. So to what extent should the tax exemptions be maintained to the level where they are, and to what degree should the state somehow fund or subsidize private philanthropy, somehow giving private individuals the power to choose how they want to use their taxes in a way that is totally undemocratic. So that debate has been occurring. It's not making headlines every single day, but at least there is some discussion around these themes.
Okay. We have another question in the chat by Legatis, and I'm reading it. I'm a private person listening to your most interesting issues. Will you present precise examples of French foundations or initiatives on the charity sector? I would like to know whether, and if so, which relation have the following initiatives to your subject. Restaurant du Cœur, Abbé Pierre, Work for the Homeless, and the ex-bishop of Evreux, whose name she can't remember.
So, yes, I could give examples of French foundations. So, Resto du Cœur, so this is for those who may not be familiar with the French context. Resto du Cœur is an association, so a not-for-profit organization created by a former humorist, so someone who was called Coluche. He was someone who was loved by the French people, a very committed actor and really funny guy, but also very much deeply engaged for social issues. And so it in the 80s he made a statement saying, no one should be hungry in a country that is so rich as France. And so let's say this Restaurant du Cœur, so this heart's restaurant, as a means to, it's basically it's like soup kitchens. I mean, it's giving foods to for free to people who do not have access, who are poor and who may have issues just feeding themselves and their families. It's a very visible organization, strongly rooted in local communities, working with a lot of volunteers and working mostly with philanthropic resources. Organize major events where it's a lot of small gifts that are given by French people to Resto du Cœur. I limited my talk to institutional philanthropy, foundations, and so Resto du Cœur is not a foundation, it's an association that is raising philanthropic funds from either individuals, corporations. They probably also receive some public funds. So technically, Restaurant du Cœur is not a foundation, but is definitely one of the most prominent not-for-profit organizations in France, playing an amazing role in really just feeding the people who need food, and who can do that thanks to philanthropic gifts, either in time, volunteers, or in money from the people. L'Abbé Pierre is also, it's an amazing organization that l'Abbé Pierre, so Abbé Pierre was a priest who at the end of the war was really realizing how many people in France were living in slums around the cities, and so he really dedicated himself to creating communities of people who would self-organize to collect old material, like old objects that then they would sell again. So this idea of somehow circular economy, and in a way they could then fund their own housing. Then so that's les communautés Emmaüs, the Emmaüs communities. And then he also created a foundation, which is a foundation really, to really do research on the issue of housing and homelessness and challenges associated with housing. So these are certainly major philanthropic organizations in France. One being an association, the other one being a foundation. Among some of the most visible foundations in France, we have, on the one hand, I've already mentioned it, the Fondation France. I can also mention some of the family foundations, for instance, that would fund our chair in philanthropy, among many other things. That would be then these foundations by La Famille Bettencourt. So it's the heir of the L'Oréal founder, and they are very committed to supporting the arts on the one hand, science on the other, and then solidarity and social initiatives. So they have really three main fields of activity, and they're really, at least in the past, being selecting specific projects and organizations to support them over the long term. Then there are also other forms of foundations that take the form of community foundations, so more local, collective institutions where a group of actors would then get together to try to support local initiatives. So I have one in mind which is called Mécènes et Loire. So it's in the Loire region, where a group of companies and other local actors get together to try to mobilize, raise funds and contribute funds to support various activities at the local level. So they're really, and then there's a lot of corporate foundations. I'm sure you also have in Germany, which are more related to for the company to try to raise its profile and somehow highlight the role that it can play in society in various sectors. So this is, in terms of examples, these are a few examples that I can share, but there are now quite a few, so it would be difficult for me to be very exhaustive and representative in my examples.
Well, thank you very much for these examples. In the chat, we have the next question by Steffi Kunzelnik. Do you recognize a higher degree of strategic philanthropy by entrepreneurial philanthropists and their foundations?
Yes, this is again a great question. Historically, the approach of the early philanthropists in the French context, their approach was very, I don't really like the term, but charitable, in the sense that they were, mainly concerned about, picking a specific, social or public need and, giving to it without necessarily thinking about how is exactly my gift, my philanthropy gift, going to impact the beneficiaries, whether it's individuals or foundations or local associations receiving the gift. And in that regard, the gifts could be described as not very strategic in a way. And we have seen, especially since the early years 2000, indeed a growing number of younger actors becoming philanthropists, entrepreneurs, having sold their company early and then having decided in their 40s or 50s that they actually want to engage in philanthropy. We've called them, la nouvelle philanthropie, the new philanthropy. So we've seen that in France a bit as what we saw in the US with the Silicon Valley philanthropists that somehow applied entrepreneurial approaches to philanthropy. To some extent, we've also seen some of this in France, with a different magnitude, but we've seen the emergence of younger philanthropists with entrepreneurial experience who have indeed tried to apply some of their strategic, entrepreneurial, managerial skills to the practice of their philanthropy. And so, yes, we've seen the development of foundations really, thinking hard about how is it that they can have the most impact. So this idea of, impact maximization, the idea of, somehow applying some of the investment practices to the philanthropic sector through what could be called, although the term has never really took off in France, but this idea of venture philanthropy, at least this idea of, really thinking hard about the best way in which philanthropic resources can be channeled to really have an impact on the ground has grown in France. It's difficult to say, whether it's now the majority of foundations, but certainly the philanthropy that is today, the most visible and the most, present in the media, etc., would be these more entrepreneurial approaches to philanthropy. We have, for instance, the EPIC Foundation that was created by Alexandre Mars. He's a young, an entrepreneur in his late 40s, I would say, who succeeded in, he's French, he succeeded in the US, he created 2 or 3 companies that he sold, and then decided in his mid-40s to work on his philanthropy full-time. He's in the media all the time and everywhere, really with the goal of trying to promote philanthropy and to make it a norm. He says giving a norm. So this is certainly something new in the French context that at times raises question. What does is he here to self-promote, or is he here to promote philanthropy, or is he here to promote really giving? So it did create a bit of debate in the sector, but we definitely see the emergence of these new practices. We again at the chair in philanthropy, we maybe contributed a bit to this dynamic. We recently adapted to the French context a book. I think this is a book that is I did here, which is about vers une philanthropie stratégique, so towards strategic philanthropy, which is an adaptation of the work done by Peter Frumkin, who is one of my former professors that I met at Harvard, and who was one of the first writer in the US context to publish serious academic research on strategic philanthropy. So we adapted that that book to the French context using French examples, etc. And so this book has been quite well received in the sector. And so certainly there is a growing recognition that maybe, strategic thinking can be applied to the practice of philanthropy. There are many ways to, think strategically about philanthropy, but so it's not, totally embraced by everyone and anyone, but it's growing, I would say, and a topic of reflection and discussion within the sector.
Okay, for the moment we have no further questions in the chat. So maybe I can raise something. When you were describing how French people participate in philanthropy or perceive philanthropy today, you mentioned fraternity. And then I jumped to the French Revolution. It was like liberté, fraternité, égalité. So transferring it to philanthropy in France today, could we say it's the liberty to give what I want and to whom I want to? It's the giving is an expression of fraternity, working in the direction of equality?
I think we should hire you to promote philanthropy in France. Yes, I mean, this is certainly why in the end, although there is a really, deep attachment to, the role of the state and the fact that, some goods should be provided by the state. On the other hand, there is, an overall quite, deep and large acceptance for philanthropy, probably because indeed, as you just said, it somehow resonates with, the three values of core values of the French Republic. So, at the end, the matter is certainly more about, whether or not we want philanthropy. I think the French society wants philanthropy and probably needs philanthropy. And the question is probably more about, how to build a fruitful relationship to the state and how to really use philanthropy in a way where it can have a unique role and impact, maybe, in funding social innovation and the development of new initiatives, new ideas that can be really, fruitful and unique, whereas the state is always needed when it comes to, making sure that some specific initiatives can be brought to scale and can be then, made equally and in an egalitarian fashion available to everyone. So there's probably more work to be done to try to really build the right. It would be problematic if at some point the state would say, there are fields where I'm going to actually withdraw my resources because I think that it's only private money that should fund that. I think that would probably generate some hard debate. But the question is probably not about whether we want philanthropy, but whether how do we want to frame it and how do we want to make it synergetic to public and governmental activities, state activities.
We are almost coming to the conclusion of our meeting and our discussion. And I would like to invite you to have the last word, but with a little provocation, playing a bit on the tune that Gudrun has just used. And just would be curious about your reaction to a little observation. Maybe while the French elites 2 years ago in April were competing for power and the recognition of the state when they were offering their billions, the French citoyens are competing for the fraternité when they offer their little gifts and when they contribute to the many organizations in the country that may not be large endowed foundations, but maybe the many non-profits and the many social enterprises or associations that are now working on the local level. So while the elites are competing for power with the state, the citoyens are competing for their fraternity. Your last word and the reaction.
I mean, yes, certainly, and it is in many ways, questioning the intersection between philanthropy and democracy, because indeed, elites can have important power and influence in shaping priorities and activities through their philanthropy, and this is certainly an issue of interest. I would say, probably this issue around Notre Dame is one of the first time when it was really made, visible in the French society. But this is certainly an issue. Fraternité is indeed, something that needs to be fought for every single day, and the dynamism and the importance that the not-for-profit sector has. We have more than 1 million not-for-profit spread all across the world, with the country, and a lot of volunteers involved in these organizations. So certainly fraternity is there, is likely to be challenged in difficult times like the one that we know these days. So it's a never-ending work, I would say, which is both protecting égalité and inégalité are growing in France. It's fighting for fraternité by making sure that everyone has access and the time and resources to contribute, and the liberté is also in these days one thing that we realize we should cherish and can also be deeply challenged. So it's a never-ending war, I would say, that we have to engage in. And I will stop here.
Sorry, I should switch the microphone. Thank you very much, Anne-Claire, for having highlighted the great values of the French Revolution for us again, the timeless values that I think we indeed are looking forward to have a continuing debate on, including a continuing exchange with you and your work. And my particular gratitude for your contribution tonight, and thank you very much to all participants who did not have to leave us already. And we, as we told you, we are recording the session and will be providing it online for those who may not have been able to join tonight.
Thank you, really thank you for the invitation. I wish I could have come to Heidelberg to try to practice my German a bit more. So I promise to make this happen as soon as the conditions permit. And thank you all for staying here. We are all very, very tired of this, video conferences. So I really appreciate your presence and your really great questions. So thank you very much, and looking forward to continue the conversation.
Oh, thank you also from my side, Anne-Claire. It was a very fascinating presentation, and I enjoyed the discussion afterwards. Thanks to the audience for the questions. Indeed, they were very interesting and inspiring. And I want to have the look into the future. On 19th of May, we will welcome Professor Alex Turini from Bologna, and he will explore the institutionalization of cultural philanthropy in Europe and the US. And we are looking forward to your renewed participation then, and hope you will join us again. Thank you.